everyone. Good evening and welcome. I am Caitlin Leisure, the Development Manager at Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, and thank you for joining us on our Made Local series to celebrate the launch of Lynn Emanuel's sixth collection of poetry, Transcript of the Disappearance, Exact, and Diminishing. I'd like to thank our partner, the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, whose beautiful home we are in tonight, and we also thank the Regional Asset District and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts for their support. Our friends at Whitewell Bookstore are here with signed copies of Lynn's work for sale. After the program, Lynn and our moderator Maggie are both happy to personalize your books, and the line will start right here at the front of the stage. Tonight, Lynn will be in conversation with Maggie Anderson, poet and professor emerita at Kent State University. Maggie is a widely celebrated writer, poet, and scholar. She is the author of 5 books of poems and is the founding editor of the Wick Poetry First Book Series and the Wick Poetry Chapbook Series for Ohio poets. She co-founded the poetry journal Trellis, and her poems have been published in the American Poetry Review and New Letters, just to name a few. Her work has appeared in more than 50 anthologies and textbooks. Introducing Lynn tonight is Leslie Rains, publicity manager of the University of Pittsburgh Press. Leslie joined the press after managing City of Asylum Bookstore on Pittsburgh's North Side. And as a bookseller and a publicist, Leslie believes deeply in advocating for books and writers. So we're very happy to have her here with us tonight. So with that, please welcome Leslie Rains.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Rains, and as Caitlin just mentioned, I'm the publicity manager at the University of Pittsburgh Press. It's great to be here tonight. It's great to be among a lot of friends that I can see, and it's great to be celebrating Lynn Emanuel. People often ask me, what does a publicity manager do exactly? I tell them it's a mix of pitching reviews and arranging interviews and setting up events, but fundamentally, what I do is advocate for books and authors. I'm lucky because each season I get to work with some pretty terrific authors. And when I'm really lucky, I get to work with someone as wonderful and as talented as Lynn. With 6 poetry collections, Lynn has been a force in American poetry for over 4 decades. Now, with her most recent collection, Transcript of the Disappearance, Exact, and Diminishing, Lynn reflects on the immensity and the intimacy of a life in poems. She is both visceral and tender, roiling and calm, emotional and funny. It's a brilliant collection. But don't just take my word for it. As Pulitzer Prize winner Diane Seuss says, this is Lynn Emanuel's masterwork. Lynn is the author of Noose and Hook, Hotel Fiesta, The Dig, Then Suddenly, and most recently, The Nerve of It, which received the Lenore Marshall Award from the Academy of American Poets. Her work has been collected numerous times in the Best American Poetry and included in the Oxford Book of American Poetry. She has been published and reviewed in the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Bomb Magazine, Poetry, and Publishers Weekly. She has been a judge for the National Book Awards and has taught at many venues, including the Warren Wilson MFA program and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to mention Ed Ochester, Lynn's longtime editor and beloved friend who passed away recently. Ed guided the Pitt Poetry series into the iconic series it is today, and we miss him very much. His vision and heart lives on in Lynn's work. Lynn will be joined in conversation tonight by her friend of 42 years, poet Maggie Anderson. Maggie is the author of 5 books of poems, most recently, Dear All from Four Way Books. She is the founding editor of the Wick Poetry Prize and the Wick Poetry Chapbook Series for Ohio poets. She has co-founded numerous journals in her poets, and her poems have appeared in the American Poetry Review, New Letters, Prairie Schooners, among many others. Her work has also appeared in more than 50 anthologies and textbooks. She is currently working on a novel. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Lynn Emanuel and Maggie Anderson.
great to see you all. I only see well-groomed, shiny hair. Really?
Yes, that's true.
No faces. Okay.
Okay. So I am just delighted and honored to be here with Lynn to talk about her fascinating, wonderful new book, Transcript of the Disappearance, Exact and Diminishing. And I thought it's such an unusual title that I wanted to hear Lynn talk a little bit about the title. Why disappearance? Why transcript?
Okay. Yeah. One of the things, I mean, there are two ways of me talking about transcript and disappearance. One of the things I say about this book is that the pandemic wrote it. And that I didn't write about the pandemic. I wrote from it and because of it. And on my desktop, the way I came about the title, I had a little sticky note that said Transcript of the Disappearance. And I've now had to, mostly because Maggie kept asking me, well, why is it a transcript? And, and I had to say that a transcript is not a journal, it isn't a diary, it isn't even a record. It's a very specific kind of document. It is what is said about what has happened. It can be used at a trial. It is evidence. It is not about impression or interpretation. And as such, it establishes a kind of record that fights against vanishing, which is one of the things that figures so largely in this book.
So the book has 3 sections, and they're related but not directly. The first section talks a lot about birth, different kinds of birth, and also has several elegies. So it's also talking about death, and that juxtaposition sort of sets up the conditions for the section. One of the things at the end, there is a poem in there which refers to several painters, Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, contemporary or modern painters from the last century. And Lynn, your father, Lynn Emanuel, was a well-known painter and also a part of the abstract expressionist school of art. And I would be interested to hear just a little bit, since there are some poems in here about her father and his art studio. What was the influence of having a father who was also a known painter on your work?
Yeah, it was, you made the best comment about this, but for example, I remember being, quite young in my father's studio, and there was a vase with flowers in it. And my father said, I want you to draw this vase, but it is also, as you are drawing it, your mother. And I think that one of the terrific things Maggie said about it is that thus is a simile born, where you have 2 terms and they are part of one another, but one doesn't dominate the other. It's not like Shakespeare saying, Juliet is the sun. It's like Robert Burns saying, my love is like a red, red rose. It's a doubleness in a way that I don't think a metaphor is. So, yeah, and I think I learned that in art school in my father's studio when he said, it's your mother and it is a vase of flowers. And your job is to bridge those two.
I want to add, too, that in my experience of reading Lynn's work over 6 books, she is a master of the simile. She can turn anything into anything else. So, I don't know, did you want to read a little bit from the in the artist studio?
Sure. What page is that?
26.
26, okay. Let me get there.
This poem also I especially wanted her to read because the phrase that begins the poem, "Everything began with something broken," is one of the main themes, and it's mentioned again. She uses that phrase again.
Yeah, and I have to, my background is so eccentric that, and Maggie reminds me of this, that not everyone knows how clay is fired in a kiln. So I have to explain that a little. But my father would make sculpture out of clay, and then he would fire the sculpture in a kiln so that it was, hard, solid, and would provide something that could be cast in bronze. But his pieces were very big, and the kiln was small. It was in our backyard. And so he would make a figure, and then he would cut it apart with wire, and then he would put the individual pieces into the kiln. Everything began with something broken. The pink terracotta sculpture fired in fat slices and arriving broken from the kiln. And the epoxy, poisonous looking and malodorous. He used it to glue her together, the dismembered woman propped on the floor and the pedestal. There was the smell of epoxy and the fearful work of it, the stiff oxblood-colored honey of it, holding the limbs, head, and torso together, the glue of it leaking out of the joins, and the heavy easel, an altar, red, purple, black gouts of paint on the canvas. And there was the lathe, the sparks rising from it, the wheel grinding everything down to a hurtful burnishment.
Thank you. You learned that from your father too. That things can fall apart in the process of making art,
Yeah.
and that they can be glued together.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the second section of this book, which is called Breath Was. And what it is really is an account of a depression. Everything began with something broken, sort of echoes through this. One of the things that strikes me in these sad poems is somehow or other, maybe you learned that from your father, I don't know.
No, I didn't.
She manages to get some humor in. I'm going to read this one. It's a very short piece. I'm writing an elegy for my shoes, both the black and the brown suede with 3-inch heels. I have written an elegy for the doorbell, the absurd carpeting, the eczema of peeling paint, the smell of the chicken grilling in Cayenne. In the middle of a depression, that's a way to go,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Were you really conscious of that as you were writing these poems, that some of them would be funnier than others?
I've never thought of any of these poems as funny. When you read that to me, I thought, oh my God, I mean, it was a terrible time. And as one of the pieces says, things disappeared from my consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so I was taking notes so that I could refer to them later and know what was there and what had been there. And so I didn't have a good memory during the Depression and the pandemic. I couldn't remember things. And can I talk about Rachel White-Reed?
Yeah.
Okay. So about the disappearance, I saw a show in New York, and there was a British artist, Rachel White-Reed, and I entered a gallery, and there were things here and there, and in the middle of the floor was this very large rectangle of white plaster. And it was it was the exact dimension of the negative space under her dining table. And a dining table would be a place of conversation and friendship and food and wine and camaraderie or fights, but all of those are memories. And what she had done is to present something that was completely featureless and blank. And you wouldn't even know that this was the space under her dining table unless you read the little plaque on the wall. And I felt that's what was happening to memory. It was becoming extinct. And this was her impression of that happening. That memory, that we didn't even have memory anymore. This is what memory was. It was white, plain, featureless. It was the erasure of memory. And so, yeah.
Part of that, I think, for me, and we've talked about this as friends, during the pandemic, there was a sense that it was all over, especially in the beginning.
Right. The end of the world, you said.
Yeah, it felt a little like the end of the world. And the title and the poems about the memory being gone are really some of the strongest in this book, I think, because we think about the body being gone, we think about friends and family, et cetera, but memory would go if we were all gone. One thing that you've written about before in other books, but it's really central in this book, is the ways in which, in the second section, there are a lot of poems from childhood, but I think the vehicle for getting to the poems of childhood, in which there's a stage set and then people come on and things happen, have to do with your affection for and understanding of film noir. It's a central theme in your book. There's a poem in here, if you would want to read it, on page 36, My Life in Noir Films.
Okay. 36.
I think this one really shows how crucial noir films are to your memory of your childhood.
My life in noir films. They were documentary, an archive. In them, I could behold everything I had beheld. The paranoia, the violence, even the famous visual signatures were not simply a style. They were a record, a mirror of lived experience. My girlhood happened in black and white, and like noir films, was dreamy, strange, erotic, ambivalent, and cruel.
That poem sort of introduces a series of poems in the middle of this book about childhood. And there's a quote, epigraph at the beginning of that section from the writer Catherine Gammon, who says, "This is not noir, this is childhood." And the connections there, I think, are really, really strong. I've always felt that in your work, Lynn, there's a sort of cinematic thing, always a visual thing, and that may be in part from growing up with a writer. But in these scenes where you're being very cinematic and creating, you know, a real place, there are always characters. And what interests me is that anyone in your poems can be a character. In earlier books, you introduce characters by homages to Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Sharon Stone, and somehow or other all of these people become characters as you write your homage to them. The book Noose and Hook is mostly told in the voice of a dog. And it seems to me that with that cinematic kind of thing you've got there, you have a really clear sense of scene. One of the childhood memories in this book is a poem called My Mother's Parents Owned the Collins Hotel on Route 80 in Ely, Nevada. And just to sort of demonstrate the noirness of this, could you read the beginning of that poem on page 39?
Yeah. The lobbies and hallways were tiled in black and white linoleum and lit with dim sconces. Each room contained an iron bedstead, a deal dresser, a sink. The windows were decked out with the same jaundiced blinds that hung in my friend Maria's windows. I saw this room time and again at the movies, where the camera seemed to be waiting for me in its emptiness. My mother was out of work, and we were living in one of the hotel's vacancies. There was a whitewashed bedstead with a headboard whose iron bars had a Romanesque curve, a chenille spread nearly bald from my picking out the threads, and a dish filled with pinion nuts on the dresser.
That is so cinematic, and the voice of the poet acts really as the director. The other thing that I like or notice in that poem is your childhood had a lot to do with being the child of a single mother. The father was off painting and being an artist, and not living in very good circumstances, which makes me think of the other epigraph to this section by Eddie Muller. Noir is working class tragedy. So I've been thinking about regionalism in your work.
Okay, could we just talk briefly a little more about the films?
Sure.
Before we move there? Yeah, I've said to Maggie, and I may have said to other people here, that I would never have written noir poems if I hadn't moved to Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, I discovered class, and I discovered the struggle of very rich people and people who were not. And it made me aware that, of course, my own family belonged to a class, and that it was in noir films that was they absolutely mirrored my experience. If there was a shot in a room, I knew how that smelled, and if there was a certain piece of clothing, I had seen it in my own life. I don't know if there's another way today to have that for a human being. But I think it was also because at that time, in a way, the world had, the American world had been, in a sense, simplified by World War II. And that also yeah, and that in this little town that I lived in, but also when my mother and I moved to Denver, which at that time was a little town, my mother said the biggest cultural event in Denver is when they run the cattle through the Brown Palace Hotel, which is what they did. They ran the prize bull through the Brown Palace Hotel, which was the swankiest hotel in Denver. Yeah, so Noir was just everything. It was not only a record of what I experienced, but it was art. And in those isolated places, that's what I had. That's what we all had, you know? Or so I feel.
Yeah, that seems absolutely right to me. Yeah, there's another poem in this book, which I'm not going to ask you to read, in which the objects Noir film are focused on. The coffee mug, what else is in there?
Yeah, I think it's a glass with a martini glass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because of Lynn, I've looked at a number of noir films in my life. And the objects are crucial, and the black and white is so stark. And it's really, these films are beautiful and a little cheesy sometimes, sentimental. There's a good guy and a bad guy. But I'm grateful that you've kind of introduced me to noir films.
Well, and also the good guy is always the poor guy.
That's
and
right.
the bad guy is
It's
always
rich guy.
the rich guy.
Yeah,
And, you know, yeah, so I just point that out
yeah, that's true.
to clarify.
Yeah, we want to clarify about
She's
noir.
a beginner at this, at noir films.
Yes, I don't know very much about them. But I did want to just say, and you sort of underscored that by saying that you began to write noir films because you moved to Pittsburgh. There are lots of places in these poems, and unlikely places. Ely, Nevada, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Paris, New York City. I mean, it's just a sort of category of your writing that the first thing we have to understand is what it looks like and where is it. And some of where it is and what it looks like is very anonymous. And there is a poem on page 51 in which you're writing from a highway hotel room, which is a kind of place. Did you read that one?
Would you read it? Or would you rather I read it? I'd rather you read it.
All right. We could go couple
Because you're so good at it. No, really. Would you mind?
No.
Okay, great.
Photos from a highway hotel room. As an epigraph from Lisa Robertson, I go to the hotel to evade determination. I love my misery first, then the overexposure that turns this shot into a blank check. All the possibilities of the bad photograph are here. The misunderstandings, the obscurities. A woman in pink heels, pink dress, drags a suitcase across the moody, unlit parking lot. Citizens of the provisional, get out of bed. It's 3 a.m. We have come here to feel anonymous as distant ships. Also, this hotel has the biggest desks. In the dark, an unkindness of ravens talks to itself. What can one say between empires? The bolt is rusty, the computer jammed. At a door, a big black truck, cab light on, a man in a mustache writing on a sliver of paper. To write, to seduce, to triumph. But among some poems I find literature, death without peace. And beyond the window, unroomed night, downpouring.
Thanks for reading that.
There's a wonderful scene in that. It's about so many things, which is the thing about your poems. A lot of them are about 20 or 30 things at the same time. And I remember you telling me once that one of your early favorite poets was Ovid,
Oh, yeah.
who's
Oh,
always
yes.
metamorphosizing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I feel that in the
I
poems.
mean, you know, what was that assignment I got from my father?
Right.
You know, take this,
And turn it
and
into that.
change it into this. You know, yeah, when I read Ovid, it was like, oh my God, it's not just my crazy father. It's a great poet who,
Yeah. Ovid.
yeah, yeah.
One of the things about that ability is that you can feel tremendously powerful. It gives you a kind of agency that something is a bowl, vase of flowers, and then I make it something else. So, the last section of the book is a long sequence. And for me, it's the most transcript-like. The section is called Pandemia, Elegy, and it tells about the days and the materials of the days in little accounts of what the poet was doing during that time. And this is a quote from one of the poems. "And I build a kind of character, confusing or maybe funny. Some part of the diary I invented, some is actual. Things I ate, phone calls, drugs I might want to take, funny recipes." And I think this is a very complicated section because it's about a time, about the pandemic, I guess. But it's also funny and, you know, really exact, though diminishing, in terms of what was going on for one individual during the pandemic. And I'm not saying everything here is true, but I would like you to read a few of these.
Sure. And I do, I mean, in the notes in the back, I give credit to Deborah Bogan, to whom I sent an email, and she lineated it. So, yeah, this is like a co-authored
Yeah.
poem. Yeah, okay.
Which one you want to read?
Let's see, hold on.
Well, don't just read one, read a couple.
Okay. Day 3. I drank a quarantini, ate black beans and rice, and an ampule of 300 milligrams bupropion. I listened to the poet Desiree Alvarez at the Y, and my cousin, Tuznel Block, calls while I am on my way to a drunk. It is a drunk that seems to contain all drunks, flickering, overlapping, and surging. I was a drunk elephant, and I wrote this sentence: America, this time you have gone too far, and I am not the only one who thinks so. Hola.
There you go.
I told Maggie I wasn't going to read these, so thank
they're
you.
great. You have to read them. Read another one.
Okay.
Oh, do one with the word of the day. The word of the day appears in these. Which one?
Okay, yeah. I mean, there's always a word of the day. There's always something I'm eating, and there's always some drug mentioned. Okay.
Sounds like the pandemic to me.
Yeah, I mean, you know, okay. Day 5. The word of the day was flexuous. Online, I watched Adele Cassell tap dance. I paint over Isolation al fresco, which was a painting that I'm painting in this sequence. And I delve into meat. For dinner, sloppy joes and amphetamines. 10 milligrams. My friend Jade reads me these sentences on my iPhone. Everyone is in the scene, a living and breathing stage set. Do not judge. Enter the scene. New paragraph.
These are great. I love these. They're so funny. We were trying to, Lynn and I, because we are friends and we share work for many, many decades, we were trying to write something every week and share it on a FaceTime call that we had going. And that's where some of these came from.
Yeah, that's right.
We were just saying, there is a poem a day kind of thing. We said, we can't do that.
Right.
But once a week, just a little account of what went on.
Yeah, yeah. And so Maggie said, read the one about the quarantini, and then you can explain what a quarantini is. You all may already know, but in New York, all the bars were closed, and so at 5 o'clock, people would walk down the streets alone, carrying a martini glass, and they would drink their martini on the street. And it was like a little parade. And the martini was called a quarantini. So, yeah.
I love that. That's great. So I'm trying to think of some things to say about the structure of this book, but the best thing would be to have the book yourself and notice how many different ways she composes poems here. There are prose poems, there's delineated email, there are diary entries, there are collages, regularly lineated poems. It's just kind of maybe I agree with Diane Seuss, it's a masterwork of style as well as of a particular kind of writing.
Well, and as you said, I mean, when you said it was like the end of the world, the pandemic, especially in the beginning when nobody knew if it was ever going to end.
Right.
And I think it, for me, it gave me a kind of freedom. Mm-hmm. It's like, I shouldn't know. I was going to say something quite vulgar, but to hell with the couplet. I'm gonna, I'm just gonna write whatever needs to be written in whatever form I think is needed. And so it is a kind of collage of a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting in a book about disappearance and enclosure and entrapment, there is that freedom. There is that freedom.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought of that.
It seems to me that that can happen, I guess. Tragedy can make, what's that line? Freedom is nothing.
Another word for nothing
nothing
left
left
to
to
lose. I know there are people out there who know that.
Yeah, absolutely. There must be. So you and Janis Joplin are hooked up in that way. And then you've been telling me that this book is different from any of your other books, and in some ways it is. And I think, as you said in the beginning, it was written from the pandemic, and that was a different kind of time.
Yeah.
For the whole world.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we want to leave a little time here for questions. So
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say about how the book is different from your others, or how you're feeling about it now that it actually has covers and it's nice clothes on and it's out in the world?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I just want to say I think that you were so smart when you talked about the theatrical or cinematic aspect of all my poems, not just in here. And Maggie said, I would read your poems and I would think, who's the real Lynn Emanuel in these poems? And I wanted it to be that way. But I think here, in this book, during the pandemic, I was suffering so much that the poems, that they were clearly about me. They were clearly and directly and perhaps rawly about me. There was no hiding. And, I wrote about my depression, and that was uncomfortable. And I wrote about a miscarriage, which I had never written about, and that was uncomfortable too. But it was sort of, it was necessary.
Yeah.
What else could we do?
Yeah.
You know, except take our lives in our hands. And, you know, I don't like telling the truth, but, you know, making them, you know, actual.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that's very clear in all the middle section, which are all poems about your childhood, which
Yeah.
you've not written about before. One of the things we say to each other sometimes is we are very, very different as poets.
Yeah.
Lynn, I think, is a filmmaker. You know,
And you are a storyteller.
that's true.
You are a short storyteller and a novelist.
Oh my.
Well, you are. You know, we know that.
Yeah, we know that. Yeah,
Yeah,
my
we know
poems
that.
move by story, and yours
Yeah.
move by scene and
Yeah.
character. And,
Yeah.
Well, we'll have some time here for questions from people, but I want to say one other thing. Everything may be broken, as this book keeps saying, but I find it important to note that the transcript of the disappearance, exact and diminishing, is in my hand. It is a book. It has been made. So whatever else has disappeared, this is here, and I, for one, am very grateful.
I'm coming over to give you a... People know where it's from. That's my friend.
My good friend.
43 years.
That's amazing. We're not even that old. How could that possibly be? So are there questions,
Yeah.
and how do we do that? Are you going to do something with that?
We have 2 microphones on each side, Caitlin and I. So raise your hand and we will give you the microphone.
Thank you both. That was a great conversation. Lynn, what helped you out of the depression?
Drugs.
So it wasn't the writing. The writing didn't really help you.
I've never believed that writing, who said this? Anne Carson. That writing is psychoanalysis. You know, I think it saved me in this way. It was the only thing I could pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and then I realized, yeah, so, but, yeah, you know, it's genes and, you know, genetics and life.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
glad you're feeling better now.
Thank you. Are you Deb?
I am Deb.
You know, we can't see
I am Deb.
We can, okay, I see the shiny hair.
Yes.
And I see your
It is
glasses.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm not asking a question because you knew I'd make a comment and not ask a question. But when you were saying you didn't like it's telling the truth as a description for what's going on, I think a description for what's going on and what makes this book both follow upon your earlier books but also be what it is there is an offering up. I think that is the right way to think about what you did here. There's an offering up of the self, which was coming whenever it finally needed to come, and it is an act of incredible generosity. And maybe that's where we get to with the pandemic, is you couldn't do anything about anything.
Right.
You know, you couldn't even stand on your front porch and wonder if you weren't going to get consumed by virus. So it is incredible. It put us in the spot of what else can you do? You can offer up who you really are and what's really happening and what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's how I read the book.
Thank you.
That's a good
Thank
reading.
you.
I agree with that.
I really appreciate that. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Doesn't have to be a question. You have a
Oh,
thought.
yeah.
Hello, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
Okay, I guess.
Favorite, no, that's easy. What are some of your favorite film noir
Wow.
in that genre?
That does put me on the spot. Well, I'll tell you one of the most important ones to me. And it's like, I think this was a terrific film. It was so long ago. It was about Helen Keller, and Anne Bancroft played,
The
the miracle worker.
Yeah.
And there's this amazing shot where Anne Bancroft holds Helen Keller's hand under a pump, and a drop of water hits her hand, and somehow it all comes alive, and she understands what the world is. And I saw this movie called, it's a famous one, you'll probably have seen it, called The Killers. And it stars, not Charlton Heston, the other one.
Humphrey Bogart.
No. Huh? Yes, thank you. Yes, Burt Lancaster, who, and the film opens with, and it's important that it's Burt Lancaster because he plays a character. He's like a turtle flipped over on its shell and completely helpless. And so the scene is a garage and a car and Burt Lancaster in a dirty undershirt. And so his skin is showing and it's dirty, and he's kind of, he's disheveled, he's working. And at one point he goes into the garage, and there's a small bed there, and he just lies down on it. And that's important because the other characters in this scene, and it's the opening scene of the movie, there's no backstory yet. On the other side of the street is a diner with lit windows and enclosed, and it's the absolute opposite of standing in front of a garage in your undershirt. And in the diner are, I think, 3 men armored in clothing. They have dark, long coats on. They have big, dark hats, and they are the killers. They are there to kill Burt Lancaster, and that's the beginning of the movie. And Lancaster is not only visually, vulnerable, but he doesn't even try to run away. He doesn't even try to save himself. And it was then that I understood about class. I understood about vulnerability and power. And it was, and I mean, for me, all of film noir is about class. And that quotation that you read from Eddie Mueller, that it's working class tragedy. Yeah. So I guess that's a favorite. I mean, that's a hard question, but
Yeah, I know.
it's one of the things was this iconic moment for me when I really understood in a visceral way about how vulnerable working class or below working class people were, and how, and then there was Trump. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But, you know, the other thing, Lynn, is I was really listening as you narrated that scene, which is what you do. I mean, you can describe a scene down to the coffee mugs and the undershirt, and it's right there. And
Yeah.
so I see why film noir is one of your things.
Yeah. And it's in black and white,
Always.
which is fantastic.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Yes, there's a person.
Hey,
Hi.
Lynn. How do you approach your writing? Like the approaching your writing in this book, I mean, you mentioned that you just started writing and it came out in whatever form it did, you know, whether it's prose, but at what point are you writing a project where you know it's going to be this project that assembles into a book? And I'm thinking about another book that you wrote where it's all in the voice of this dog.
Yeah.
And so in this one too, it may be in 3 parts, but at what point are you aware that you're writing a project as opposed to individual poems?
You know, with this book, I never felt I was writing a project. I was just getting from line to line. I had a friend, I'm not going to mention her name, she's a poet, and I knew her in the 70s, and she was and is a formalist, and that wasn't so popular then. And I remember asking her, why are you a formalist? How did you become a formalist? And she said, because there was a time in my life when all I could do was get from one syllable to another. And that's what I felt about this book. And that's why it's kind of wild. You know, I did whatever I did. So I never felt that about this book. But it's really interesting that Maggie mentioned the dog sequence and you mentioned the dog sequence, because I wrote that when I was in Alabama, and I couldn't write. I mean, I was the other in Alabama. I was,
Very other.
Yeah, I was very other, and I got several comeuppances from people who lived there. I had gone to a party, I guess it was in my honor, and I was saying something to one of the stunning graduate students. The graduate students were marvelous. And she said to me, well, you know, the civil rights movement did not begin in New Jersey. And so and all I could find was this voice. So I felt silenced then. I was silenced, but I got that voice, and I felt silenced during this period too. And I just got whatever voice I could hang on to.
We've had a habit over the last at least 10 or 15 years of trying to get together in the same place once a year. Yeah. And I remember when the pandemic was enough over that people were traveling, you came to my house in North Carolina with a pile of papers. And you said, this is what we have. This is what we're looking at.
Yeah.
And we spent a couple of days trying to see if any of them connected to others and how to work with it.
That's
but
right.
Very different from the pre-imagining of the dog voice.
Right.
For example.
Right.
So it's kind of serendipitous in a way.
Yeah, I mean, Maggie